Poor young bride, married a 73-year-old millionaire by contract but ended up healing his soul. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The city lights shimmered against the glass walls of Hale Enterprises, where a man sat alone in a quiet office on the top floor. His name was Richard Hale, 73 years old, a man who had built an empire of luxury hotels, hospitals, and foundations. The world called him a legend. He called himself tired. Across the mahogany table lay a document, printed neatly in black ink. It was not a business contract or a corporate merger. It was a marriage agreement. His lawyer, a man nearly half his age, stood nearby, nervous but professional. "Sir," the lawyer said softly, "the young woman has arrived." Richard closed the pen cap and looked out at the skyline. "Send her in." Moments later, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Evelyn Carter stepped out, clutching her small purse. She was 26, dressed modestly in a pale blouse and a worn gray coat. There was nothing about her that belonged in this world of glass and gold. But she walked in with quiet courage, the kind that came from necessity, not confidence. "Miss Carter," the lawyer said, "Mr. Hale will see you now." Her eyes met Richard's for the first time. The man before her looked nothing like the headlines. There was power in his presence, yes, but also something fragile behind the formality, like a man who had lived too long surrounded by silence. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, sit." The paper between them seemed to glow under the office light. Richard's voice was calm but direct. "The terms are simple. 6 months. You will attend public events with me as my wife. You will receive full financial support during that time, and compensation when it ends." Evelyn's fingers trembled as she turned the pages. Each clause was written in perfect legal precision, detached, emotionless. But at the bottom, beneath his bold signature, there was a blank space waiting for hers. She asked quietly, "Why me?" He leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Because you are not after what most people want." Evelyn's chest tightened. She wanted to say she did not want his money, but that was not true. Her mother's medical bills were drowning her. The hospice where she worked was at risk of closing. She needed this arrangement more than she wanted to admit. After a long silence, she said, "All right, I will do it." She signed her name, each letter deliberate, her heart pounding in her chest. Richard nodded once, sealing the deal with a quiet finality that felt colder than the office air. The lawyer gathered the papers and left them alone. Richard stood, buttoning his jacket. "Our wedding will be tomorrow. It will be private. My driver will take you home." Evelyn rose from her chair, clutching her purse again. "I understand." "Ugh." He paused before walking out, his voice softer this time. "Do not make the mistake of thinking this is more than business, Miss Carter. My heart stopped believing in love a long time ago." When he left, Evelyn exhaled, shakily, staring at the empty chair where he had Saturday. Her reflection in the glass window showed a woman who had just agreed to marry a stranger for money, a stranger whose name carried both power and loneliness. Outside, the night deepened. Somewhere below, the city kept moving, unaware that two lives had just been bound together not by affection, but by a contract signed under fluorescent light. And yet, as she stepped into the elevator, Evelyn could not shake the strange heaviness in her chest. Something told her this agreement would cost far more than she had bargained for. The next morning came with quiet efficiency. Evelyn stood before the mirror of a bridal room that did not belong to her, surrounded by white roses and silk curtains. The dress was elegant but simple, chosen not for love but for reputation. The veil draped softly over her shoulders, catching the morning light like a secret she could not hide. Outside, reporters waited at a distance, kept behind black iron gates. The marriage was a private affair, but rumors had already begun to spread. 73-year-old tycoon marries a woman young enough to be his granddaughter. Evelyn tried to block out the noise as she adjusted the thin bracelet on her wrist. It was the only thing she owned that carried meaning, her late father's gift, scratched but precious. She whispered to herself, "This is for Mom. This is for the hospice." When the door opened, the lawyer entered quietly. "Miss Carter, mister? Hale is ready." She nodded, and followed him through the corridor of marble floors. At the small chapel inside the Hale estate, Richard stood waiting beside the officiant. He looked composed in his black suit, silver hair perfectly combed, expression unreadable. When she walked in, he turned slightly, his blue eyes settling on her. No smile, no emotion, just acknowledgement. The ceremony lasted less than 15 minutes. Their vows were short, formal, transactional. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and Richard extended his hand politely. She placed hers in his, feeling the chill of his palm. A camera clicked once, just one photo for documentation. No applause followed, no family, no joy. Only the faint echo of the officiant's voice. You may now sign the register. After the ceremony, Richard led her out to the garden behind the mansion. You may choose a room on the east wing, he said. Breakfast is served at 7, dinner at 7:30. My assistant will help you with anything you need. Evelyn looked at the vast estate, its fountains and trimmed hedges. It was beautiful, but it felt more like a museum than a home. Thank you, she said softly. He paused, as if hearing something in her tone, but said nothing. Instead, he walked away toward the office wing, his posture straight and distant. That evening, Evelyn sat alone at the dinner table, facing a meal set for two. Richard had not come down. The butler informed her he was working late. She looked at the untouched dishes, the silver utensils lined perfectly, and felt the weight of emptiness pressing in. To fill the silence, she wandered through the mansion's long hallways. The walls were covered with portraits of Richard's ancestors, each face painted with the same air of control and formality. But one photo stopped her. It was a framed picture on a piano, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes, smiling as she held Richard's hand. Evelyn stared for a moment before asking the butler, "Who is she?" "Mrs. Hale," he said quietly. "She passed away 12 years ago. The master does not speak of her." When the butler left, Evelyn touched the edge of the frame gently. The woman's eyes seemed to follow her, calm and kind. "You must have been loved," she whispered. "Maybe he still does." The next morning, she woke early, unable to sleep. The house was silent except for the ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall. She decided to make herself useful and brewed coffee in the kitchen. The butler was startled when he saw her. "Madam, that is not necessary. I prefer to do small things," she said. "It keeps me grounded." Later, she noticed the garden outside her window. The roses had wilted slightly from neglect. Without asking, she spent the afternoon pruning, watering, and cleaning the flower beds. By sunset, the once dull garden looked alive again. From the office balcony above, Richard stood watching. His assistant had been speaking about a charity project, but he was no longer listening. Instead, his eyes followed Evelyn as she knelt by the rose bushes, her dress stained with soil, her hair tied back. She hummed softly, unaware of being watched. When the assistant noticed his distraction, he stopped talking. "Sir?" Richard blinked and turned away. "Continue." That night, as Evelyn passed the study, she saw a faint light inside. Richard sat by the window, staring at a half-finished glass of wine. For a moment, she thought to greet him, but something in his posture, rigid yet lonely, held her back. She left quietly, closing the door without a sound. Upstairs, she opened the contract once more, reading its cold, printed words. No emotional expectations, no interference with private matters. She sighed, folded it back into the drawer, and looked out the window at the mansion below. In another room, Richard exhaled slowly and looked at the music box sitting on his desk. It had belonged to his late wife. The melody had stopped working years ago. He twisted the key out of habit, but no sound came, only silence. Downstairs, Evelyn whispered to herself as she looked at the garden she had revived. A house this beautiful should not feel this sad. She did not know that, somewhere in that same house, a man who had sworn off love was quietly wondering who this young woman really was and why her presence made the silence feel almost bearable. Days passed quietly inside the Hale mansion. The rhythm of life there was slow, deliberate, and bound by routine. Every morning at 7, breakfast was served, porcelain cups, silver utensils, a vase of fresh lilies placed exactly at the center of the table. Evelyn would sit across from an empty chair more often than not. Richard preferred to take his meal in the study, claiming he needed to work through reports. She tried to adjust to the new rhythm, though it felt unnatural. Her world before had been filled with noise, children laughing at the hospice, the hum of the city streets. her mother's soft voice calling her name. Now there was only silence, broken occasionally by the distant sound of Richard's footsteps echoing down the marble corridor. One afternoon, while exploring the West Wing, Evelyn came across a locked door. The butler quickly intercepted her. "That is Mr. Hale's private library," he said politely. "He does not allow anyone inside." She nodded, but the curiosity stayed with her. That night, she found herself standing near that same hallway again, watching the flicker of light coming from beneath the door. A faint melody drifted out, soft piano music, slow and melancholic. She realized then that Richard played. The sound was beautiful but lonely, like a memory trapped in notes. She listened for a few minutes before quietly walking away, her heart unexpectedly heavy. The following morning, Evelyn found Richard already at the dining table. It was the first time he had joined her. He greeted her with a small nod. No smile, but no distance either. "I noticed the garden looks different," he said. She placed her napkin on her lap. "It needed care." He looked at her for a moment, then said, "It was my wife's favorite place." The silence that followed was gentle, not awkward. She wanted to ask about his late wife, but decided not to. Instead, she said softly, "Then I hope she would have liked it this way." For a brief second, his expression changed, less guarded, almost human. Then he straightened again, retreating behind formality. "You may continue tending it if you wish," he said before returning to his newspaper. That evening, as she watered the last row of roses, she noticed the butler approaching with a wrapped box. "From Mr. Hale," he said. Inside was a pair of gardening gloves, new, expensive, but practical. Evelyn smiled faintly and whispered, "Thank you," even though the giver was nowhere nearby to hear it. Later that week, Richard held a dinner for members of the Hale Foundation. It was the first event they would attend together publicly as husband and wife. Evelyn was nervous. She had never been part of such a crowd. The mansion filled with polished guests and camera flashes. As they stood side by side, reporters called out questions. "Mr. Hale, is it true you married for companionship? Mrs. Hale, what is it like to be married to one of the richest men in the country?" Richard's hand hovered near hers, but he did not take it. "We prefer to keep our private life private," he said simply, guiding her past the cameras. Inside, Evelyn smiled politely as introductions blurred together investors, philanthropists, board members. But one guest, a woman named Victoria, leaned close and whispered just loud enough for others to hear, "You must be very lucky, my dear. Some of us wait decades for such fortune to fall into our laps." Evelyn froze for a moment, then forced a polite smile. "Luck is not always what it seems," she said quietly before walking away. Later, as the event ended, Richard found her standing near the balcony, looking out at the city lights. "You handled them well," he said. "I have been poor my whole life," she replied. "Words cannot bruise as much as hunger can." He looked at her, studying her calmness. "You remind me of someone," he murmured. She turned slightly. "Your wife?" He hesitated, then nodded once. "She had your strength. I did not realize it until she was gone." They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them shifting. For the first time, Evelyn saw something fragile behind his composure regret. Days later, while dusting the piano room, she noticed the old music box on his desk. It was small, made of ivory and brass, but the wind-up key was missing. She asked the butler about it, and he said quietly, "The master broke it years ago after his wife's funeral. He has never touched it since." That night, while he was out, she sat by the desk and examined the box. She found the key tucked inside a drawer, bent but repairable. With careful fingers, she fixed it and turned it gently. The melody began to play soft, trembling notes that filled the air like memory returning home. When Richard returned, he found her standing by the desk, startled but not guilty. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "It was broken. I just wanted to—" He stopped her with a raised hand. The music box continued to play. His eyes softened, and for the first time, he did not look like a businessman or a millionaire. He looked like a man remembering love. "Thank you," he said simply. From that night on, something shifted between them. He began joining her for breakfast more often. Sometimes they spoke about the hospice. Sometimes they sat in silence, but it was a comfortable silence. Evelyn still reminded herself that it was a contract, nothing more. But when she caught him glancing her way during dinner or leaving small gestures of thoughtfulness, a cup of tea on her reading table, A blanket folded neatly by her chair, she began to wonder if hearts, no matter how guarded, could truly stay untouched forever. Neither of them knew it yet, but the distance that once defined their lives was quietly disappearing, one small act of kindness at a time. Autumn arrived slowly at the Hale mansion, turning the garden into a canvas of gold and red. The air carried the scent of falling leaves, and the mornings grew colder. Evelyn had grown used to the rhythm of life there, though something between her and Richard had begun to change, subtle, fragile, but undeniable. One afternoon, she found him sitting in the library, reading under the soft light of the chandelier. It was the first time he had left the door open. "You can come in," he said without looking up. His voice was calm, almost gentle. Evelyn stepped inside, her hands clasped nervously. The room smelled of cedar and old books. "I was not sure if you allowed anyone here," she said. "I did not," he replied, "but rules can change." She smiled slightly, scanning the shelves. "There are so many books." He nodded. "My late wife loved poetry. I kept them for her. I never read them myself." Ugh. Evelyn pulled a small book from the shelf and read aloud softly, "Love is not bound by age or time. It is the echo of kindness that never fades." He looked up then, their eyes meeting. "She used to read that exact line," he said quietly. The silence that followed was different this time, warm instead of heavy. Evelyn closed the book gently. Maybe some echoes are meant to return. Later that week, a letter arrived from the Hale Foundation. The annual charity gala was approaching, and the board expected both Richard and his wife to attend. Richard mentioned it at dinner, his tone casual but distant. "It will be formal, cameras, investors, and questions. I will understand if you prefer not to go." Evelyn set down her fork. "If I am to be your wife, even by contract, then I should stand beside you." He looked at her with quiet surprise. "Very well." When the night of the gala came, the mansion buzzed with activity. Evelyn wore a gown of soft silver silk, simple yet elegant. When she entered the room, Richard paused mid-sentence. For a moment, his composure slipped. She looked nothing like the poor woman he had met months ago. She carried herself with grace that silenced the room. As they arrived at the event, whispers rippled through the crowd. "She is the young wife. How much did he pay her?" Evelyn heard it all, but kept her head high. During dinner, an investor made a cruel remark about her background. Richard, who had remained silent through most of the evening, finally spoke. "My wife's dignity does not require your approval," he said calmly, "but your lack of it says enough." The table fell quiet. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes wide with gratitude. Later, as the evening ended, they stood together under the soft glow of the chandelier. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" he asked. "For defending me." He gave a faint smile. "You did not need defending. You belonged there, whether they knew it or not." Outside, the night air was crisp, and the world seemed quieter. As they walked toward the car, their hands brushed accidentally. Neither of them pulled away. It was not affection, not yet, but it was the first moment that felt real. From the balcony above, Victoria watched them through narrowed eyes, a glass of champagne in her hand and a smile that did not reach her eyes. The perfect couple had just given her the perfect story to destroy. The next morning, the world outside their quiet estate had already begun to whisper. Headlines filled the news feeds and tabloids. Young wife of 73-year-old tycoon steals the spotlight at charity gala. Photographs of Richard and Evelyn standing together under the chandelier spread across the internet. Some praised her elegance, others mocked the age gap and accused her of marrying for money. Inside the mansion, Evelyn tried to ignore it. She made tea, arranged flowers, and returned to her daily routine. But the silence in the house felt heavier. The staff spoke softly around her. Even Richard seemed distant again, buried in phone calls and meetings. By afternoon, a call came from the Hale Foundation board. Victoria, his late partner's niece and current board member, had requested an emergency meeting. Richard left immediately, his face unreadable. Hours later, when he returned, Evelyn was waiting in the parlor. "What happened?" she asked. He removed his coat slowly. "Victoria brought up the contract," he said. "Someone leaked it." Evelyn froze. "The marriage contract?" He nodded once. "She claims the foundation's reputation is at risk. The press will have it by morning." Her voice trembled. "Then they will know I married you for money." Richard looked away. "I will handle it." That night, the mansion felt colder than ever. Evelyn sat in her room, reading through the contract she had once signed without hesitation. Each clause now felt like a weight on her chest. No emotional expectations, no interference, no public disclosure. She had followed every rule, yet somehow, the world had twisted it into shame. The next morning, the story broke nationwide. Headlines shouted betrayal and deceit. Young bride exposed in secret marriage contract. Cameras gathered at the gates. Reporters shouted her name. Evelyn stayed inside, her hands shaking as she watched the news. The phone rang, constantly calls from the hospice, friends, journalists. When she finally answered one, the voice on the other end said coldly, "We cannot have you associated with our cause right now. The donors are upset." Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "I understand." Richard found her sitting by the window, her tea untouched. "Do not believe what they say," he said softly. She turned to him, her voice breaking. "You told me no one would ever know. You promised." "I did," he said, guilt in his voice. "But I underestimated how cruel people can be." She stood, her tone trembling but steady. "I came into this with nothing to lose, and somehow I have lost everything anyway." He stepped closer. "Evelyn." She shook her head. "You wanted a wife for convenience. Now you have a scandal instead." She walked past him, her footsteps echoing down the marble hall. Richard called her name, but she did not turn back. Outside, rain had begun to fall, steady and cold. She stepped into it without an umbrella, her dress clinging to her as the mansion lights faded behind her. From the study window, Richard watched her disappear into the storm. The contract that was meant to protect his world had instead destroyed the only person who had treated him as human. For the first time in years, the man who had everything realized what it meant to have nothing at all. Rain fell for 3 days straight after Evelyn left. The mansion that had once felt silent now felt completely lifeless. Richard no longer held meetings. He ignored calls from the board and refused to read the papers stacked on his desk. Every headline carried her name, twisting the truth into spectacle. On the fourth morning, the butler placed a letter on his desk. It was from the hospice. Richard opened it slowly. Inside was a short note written in Evelyn's careful handwriting. "Do not worry about me. I have gone back to where I belong. Please, take care of your health." Her words were gentle, but they hit harder than any accusation. That afternoon, Richard sat in his study staring at the old music box. He twisted the key she had repaired, and the melody began to play. It filled the room with a sound that was soft, fragile, and unbearable. He pressed his hands against his face, whispering to no one, "I never meant to hurt you." Meanwhile, across town, Evelyn returned to the hospice. The building was small and quiet, its walls painted in faded blue. The staff welcomed her back with uncertain smiles. She spent her days reading to patients, cleaning rooms, and pretending that her heart did not ache every time she saw the news on the small television in the lobby. One afternoon, a nurse handed her a newspaper with a trembling hand. On the front page was a headline, "Richard Hale, under investigation by his own board." Underneath was a photo of him leaving his office, alone. Evelyn's chest tightened. She knew the scandal had cost him more than pride, it had cost him the trust of his own company. That evening, as the sun set behind the hospice, she looked out the window and whispered, "You are paying for something that was never your crime." Oh. At the same time, Richard sat alone in his car outside the Hale Foundation building. He could see the reflection of his own face in the window, tired, older than his years, hollow. He thought of Evelyn's words, the way she had looked at him when she said she had lost everything. The next day, he called a press conference. Reporters flooded the hall, cameras flashing as he stepped onto the stage. His voice was calm but steady. "I will not deny the truth," he began. "Yes, my marriage to Evelyn Carter began as a legal agreement, but what began as a contract became something real, something I failed to protect." The room fell silent. "She did not marry me for money. She married me because she needed help, and I used that need for my own comfort. The fault is mine, not hers." He ended his speech simply, "You can strip me of my position, but you will not strip her of her dignity." That night, the world shifted. Public opinion began to soften. Some saw courage in his honesty, others saw tragedy. But one person, Evelyn, sat quietly in her small room at the hospice, tears in her eyes as she watched the broadcast. For the first time since leaving the mansion, she smiled through her tears. "You finally learned how to speak with your heart," she whispered. Outside, the rain stopped, and the first light of dawn touched the windows. Somewhere in the city, A man who had once believed he was beyond redemption was beginning to understand what love truly meant. Winter came early that year, wrapping the city in pale light and quiet streets. Richard had lost nearly everything his name once commanded: the foundation, the board's approval, the loyalty of investors, but for the first time in decades, he felt strangely free. He no longer hid behind walls of control. The house that once echoed with silence now carried only memory. He spent his mornings walking through the garden Evelyn had revived. The roses she planted had withered with the cold, but their stems still stood strong. He thought often about her words. "You wanted a wife for convenience, now you have a scandal instead." Every time he replayed them, he heard not anger, but truth. One afternoon, Mr. Harlow, a longtime friend and senior board member, came to see him. "You could have saved yourself, Richard," he said. "Why take the blame?" Richard smiled faintly. "Because she saved me long before I realized it." Mr. Harlow looked at him for a long moment and nodded. "Then do not stop there. Go make it right." That night, Richard drove to the hospice without calling ahead. Through the frosted windows, he saw Evelyn sitting by a patient's bed, reading softly. Her hair was tied loosely, her face tired but kind. He stayed outside for a while, unsure if he had the right to enter. Finally, he stepped through the door. The staff recognized him instantly, but no one spoke. Evelyn looked up, startled but calm. "You should not be here," she said quietly. "I had to see you," he replied. "I watched your strength from a distance, but I never deserved it." She folded her hands. "You do not need to say anything." "I do," he said firmly. "You came into my life for a contract. I turned it into a cage, and yet, somehow, you taught me how to be human again." Evelyn's eyes softened, though she said nothing. He placed a folded envelope on the table beside her. "This is for the hospice. It is not a gift. It is a debt I owe to you, and to the kindness you showed me." She looked at it, then back at him. "You cannot pay back healing, Richard." He smiled sadly. "Maybe not, but I can start by trying." As he turned to leave, the music box melody drifted faintly in his memory, the same one she had repaired. It played softly in his mind, and for the first time in years, his heart felt light. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the hospice windows for the first time in weeks. Evelyn arrived early, carrying fresh flowers for the patients' rooms. When she entered the common hall, she found a crowd gathered near the front desk. Someone had delivered a package wrapped in ivory paper and sealed with the Hale Foundation's crest. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a new plaque engraved with silver letters. "The Carter Healing Center, supported by the Hale Foundation." Beneath it, a handwritten note read, "Because of you, kindness has a home again. Richard." Evelyn stood still, overwhelmed. The other nurses watched quietly, understanding the weight behind the gesture. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to smile without restraint. Later that day, as she stepped outside to arrange the flowers, a familiar car pulled up by the gate. Richard emerged, dressed simply in a wool coat, his breath visible in the winter air. He looked thinner, older, but there was peace in his eyes that she had never seen before. "I thought I told you not to come here again," she said softly, though her voice lacked conviction. He smiled gently. "You did, but I wanted to see how beautiful this place looks when it is truly alive." Ugh. She looked at him for a long moment. "You could have sent someone to deliver that plaque." "I could have," he said, taking a slow step closer. "But I needed to say thank you. You healed more than a man. You reminded me that life still means something." Evelyn lowered her gaze. "And what if I am not ready to forgive you?" "Then I will wait," he said quietly. "I have time now. Real time. Not borrowed from pride or money." The wind rustled through the bare trees. She met his eyes again, her voice soft but steady. "The hospice will always welcome anyone who wishes to start over." He nodded. "Then maybe I will start by volunteering." For the first time, she laughed a sound light enough to chase away the winter air. The two of them stood there in the morning light, not as husband and wife bound by paper, but as two people who had both learned that love, once broken, can still grow back if given a chance. Spring returned quietly to the city, and with it came renewal. The hospice, once small and struggling, now thrived as the Carter Healing Center. Patients filled the halls with laughter and music, and every window glowed with the soft warmth of morning light. Evelyn walked through the corridors each day, carrying fresh flowers, greeting everyone by name. Yet, each time she passed the engraved plaque, she paused for a moment, her hand brushing over Richard's signature. Richard came often now, not as a benefactor, but as a volunteer. He read stories to the elderly and played chess with patients who had no family. Sometimes, he would sit quietly by the window, helping Evelyn sort donations or plant seeds in the garden. They rarely spoke of the past. They did not need to. It lingered between them, not as pain anymore, but as a shared history that shaped them both. One afternoon, as the spring rain began to fall, Richard brought the old music box with him. "You fixed it once," he said softly. "Maybe it is time it belongs here." He placed it on the windowsill in the main hall, where sunlight touched its ivory frame. When he turned the key, the melody played again, clear and unbroken. The sound filled the hall, and patients stopped to listen. Evelyn watched him, her eyes warm. "You kept it all this time." "I kept it because it reminded me of you," he said. "You repaired what I thought was beyond repair." The rain outside shimmered against the glass, turning the light golden. She stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "And you taught me that love can be quiet and still matter." For a moment they simply stood there, no titles, no contract, no distance, just two souls who had found peace in each other's presence. As the melody faded, Richard looked around the hospice filled with laughter and said, "You gave this place life, Evelyn. You gave it back to me too." She smiled softly. "No, Richard, you just finally let it in." And when the music box stopped, the world seemed to hold its breath, quiet, complete, and healed at last.